there'll be many, possible political how should I say, repercussions of that. Let me put one which is very obvious and which already we see now. The center of economic activity is shifting towards the Pacific. And where Asia and also the Pacific side of the United States, where actually would become most important. Actually, even when you look today in the amount of shipping, the Pacific has overtaken the Atlantic. So we have this shift in the not only in the balance of economic power, but also in the sort of center of gravity of the world economy. The second change, which also we already see now, is that more and more people from Asia, not only China, but I'm talking about countries like China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, more and more people from those countries are now becoming part of the global top 20% or 10%, or even in some cases top 1%. This is a big change because here we are talking about the ordinal, the ranking. So, when you actually have an increase in income, that, is obviously in principle good for everybody. But when we have rankings are given. You have 100 percentiles. I mean, that's given. So if somebody moves into your percentile, as the Chinese are now moving into the percentiles, top of income distribution, that traditionally were entirely populated by people from the Western countries. As they move there, then of course people from the Western countries who used to be, in these top percentiles have obviously to move down. And I think this is a potentially big change because that was something that has never happened, in the last 200 years. And that would make a difference for, self-perception of many people in the West where they belong. It would also make Western income distributions look much more diverse than they used to. What I want to say by that is that nowadays, and until recently that was the case, you had even poor people in Western countries being placed relatively high in the income distribution of the world. And moreover, many of the consumption patterns are now globally dominated. And if you are not at the top globally, then certain consumption baskets would not be available to you. I think a nice example is, for example, tourism and travel. Now, of course, during the coronavirus, we cannot travel much, but at some point this will be over, we hope. If you actually have people who in the West who slip and fall in the relative rankings, certain things which are expensive, like international travel, would become really unaffordable to them. So it is not really relevant what your position in a global income distribution is, even if your income by itself still is increasing, but somebody is overtaking you. In other words, your income may be going up by 2% a year, but somebody who has an increase of 8% a year would gradually be richer than you. If countries fall behind, certain countries fall behind in income, behind China and other Asian countries, real estate, which now is very highly valuable, obviously, in Europe, would actually be owned by foreigners. So that's another sort of development. So it does, pose some problems, whether it is an ideal situation for a city to become basically empty of its local inhabitants. It's an issue. So I can go on with examples like that, but you get the idea that actually that the change in the economic power between the continents will have many other political and social and consumption way repercussions. Yeah, I think it does resemble what was called in those days, it was called disarticulation. And disarticulation essentially meant that you had a sliver, or some percentage of population in less developed countries that had been fully integrated in the global economy. And then you had the hinterland population that really was not integrated and continued producing really in a sort of oftentimes non-market way, and they were, basically subsistence producers. Now, obviously, the West is not like that because it's much more developed. But the basic idea that you can take from this articulation is that you have a group of local population that could be 10, 20, 30%. They're actually doing quite well, and they're fully integrated into the world economy. And then you had the middle class in many Western countries, the United States in particular, that have not been integrated, or actually the integration had worked against them because they lost their jobs or they got new jobs at a lower wage than they had before. So this is the entire problem of the, sort of middle class decline in the United States, which has clear political implications. And not only the US, you can also say for the Gilets jaunes movement in France that it represents the same problem. So there will be a, sort of dissatisfaction with globalization. I'm not sure that despite the COVID and despite all the issues that we have now, that globalization would be reversed, simply because the incentives that globalization produces are so large. In other words, if you can make much more money by employing people in a different country compared to employing the people in your own country, there is very little that can stop you about that. So in other words, the incentives are there and they will continue to be there. Moreover, the technology to do that is there, and this is not going to disappear. Actually, you can even argue, as we have now seen the ability to do many more things online and virtually, that the technology that we already knew existed, but with the corona started using much more frequently, would further make globalization attractive. Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, I agree with that because it is inequality and polarization. In other words, what has happened in the US is that you had very unequal growth rates across the income distribution. When you have very unequal growth rates, lower growth rate of income among the middle class than among the rich, then obviously inequalities increase. But just saying inequality, I think, is not sufficient. One has to say it is polarization between those people at the very top who had very specific skills. Many of them are in the financial sector. Many of them have done, graduate studies. They are, have MBAs, or they're being very successful CEOs, or they're actually founders of the new enterprises, or they're, very much at ease with new technology. And then you have lots of people who had the typical middle class, what used to be called blue-collar jobs. And these jobs have generally either been less prestigious, they are paying less, they are under pressure from Chinese imports, and they are under pressure from outsourcing. So yes, actually inequality in the US has contributed to that rejection of, by some parts of the population, rejection of globalization, political polarization, and even cultural wars. There is no doubt about that. But I just want to say that saying inequality alone is not sufficient. One has to explain how that inequality worked and how it has produced this really very huge abyss even in perception, in culture between people, so much so that when you watch what one group of people says, or actually what media that are close to them say with the media from the other group, you are basically wondering if you're in the same country at all, because the perceptions of reality are so far apart that they don't seem to be talking about the same thing at all.